Okay, everybody, I have to say that over again because apparently the recording won't pick me up. Thank you, everybody, for being here today and taking the time to come and enjoy lunch and listen to Dr. Stephen Vamosi. Stephen's here today to give us a bit of background on some of the work he's doing as the Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the Faculty of Science, and to speak to this topic on the myth of meritocracy in the Academy. So please join me in welcoming Stephen. Thank you. You're good.
All right. Good. Sounds like I'm on. So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's nice to get out of science sometimes and keep talking about science just outside the BioSci building. As mentioned, I'm the Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the Faculty of Science. If you're on Twitter, that's my handle. I'm easy to find. There aren't too many Stephen Vamosis out there. But first I just want to introduce myself in a slightly different way. So I've had the honor, the real privilege to be a part of the University of Calgary's Indigenous Strategy, initially as the working group, now as the implementation committee. And their introductions look a little bit different, right? We tend to focus in the Western sphere about our titles, our honorifics, and typically First Nations, Métis, and Inuit spend a lot more time, where are you from? Who claims you? What's a little bit about your life? So here's a little bit about me then. First generation immigrant to Canada. My parents, Ilona and Laszlo, basically went to Italy for the weekend. That was a ruse. But my dad hated being under Russian rule. And so they never went. Well, my dad actually ended up moving back. My mom stayed in Canada. Unfortunately, they both passed away in the last couple of years. So I was born in Montreal. Mostly grew up in Barrie, Ontario. Anyone know where that is? Awesome. All right, good. We were the place everyone drove through at 130, 140 kilometers an hour as they were trying to get to their cottages. And I briefly worked at the McDonald's that some of you probably would have visited. Yeah, that was awesome. It'd be like Tuesday night, it'd be super quiet, and all of a sudden you'd hear, "Bus!" And all of a sudden, 3 buses showed up, and it was just panic time. So anyways, that's where I grew up. Currently, 2 children, 1 cat. And what I do when I'm not doing this, although weather hasn't been super permissive of this, although I'm now looking at a fat tire bike, mountain biking, not the movie The Life Aquatic, but basically everything about water. I'm a fish biologist when I'm not doing the AD stuff, and I guess I had to put coffee on there as well. So we're going to do a little activity. I didn't know what the room would look like, and we don't know each other yet, so I'm not going to make anyone do anything uncomfortable publicly, but I wanted to just briefly talk about privilege before we really get into things. So has anyone ever done the privilege walk? Yeah, 1 nod, a couple of nods. Has everyone heard of it? Anyone not heard of the privilege walk? So just trying to figure out how much to explain. Okay, so basically what happens is you kind of line up with people that you know, and again, maybe you want to do this as an activity amongst yourselves. And again, I'm new to your group, and so I didn't want to suddenly put everyone on a spot and do this, but basically you line up, and then there's a series of questions that are around privilege. And basically, if you're able to say yes to something, and usually that's a positive associated with privilege, you would step forward, and then if you have experienced something, you either stay where you are or you take a step back, depending on how that setup goes. So for example, if your parents worked nights and weekends to support your family, or worked nights and weekends to make sure that you could go to higher education, you would, for example, take a step back. Okay. So what I'm going to do in the next few, and again, no, you don't have to share, just internally, because again, that's a little bit vulnerable. We'll just go through a few things, and I just want you to think about whether or not you've experienced this. So first one, have you ever been told the following? Go back to your country, you so-and-so. Okay. So again, just went to an event for the Indigenous Awareness Week. We kicked it off, and unfortunately, ironically, problematically, a lot of First Peoples hear that here in Canada. Go back to, and they're like, what? Very hurtful, right? Super hurtful. Right? So I'm very openly a settler. That's what I call myself these days, and I'm working to be an ally, but I don't call myself that. Slightly different. Do you feel unsafe walking alone at night, on campus, near your neighborhood, whatever, right? Think about that. And again, if you can say no, there's a certain amount of privilege there. It might be your neighborhood, might be your gender, it's probably your gender. might be whether or not you're a visible minority, and or the intersection of all those things. I recognize I have privilege in this, as I do in the first one. And then finally, if you're going to a new place, so for example, a concert or a play, do you have to spend a bit of time first to make sure that you're actually going to be able to get in and get your seat and actually see, right? Thus far, so I'll put myself on the spot again. I'm able to, it's not a concern. It's not something I think about. I realize that now, though. I realize that I don't have to think about that, but I don't. I just go to things, and it just kind of always works out. That's not the case for a lot of people. Okay. So basically, you would go through a series of those questions, and again, the point is that you then, at the end of it, you look at where you got to. And the nice thing about that, I mean, again, there's some reflection that I think is really good, but people will realize that along the way, everyone ends up being able to step forward, or almost everyone typically, does step forward in various ways. So the point, because I'm going to kind of go into some numbers and you know, I'll just call it out. If you're a man, you might feel like there's a little bit of finger pointing, but it's a man saying it, and I own it. So, but I just want to make sure we're all cognizant that we all have privilege. We all have things we can do, and we all have places where maybe we are not incredibly privileged. So I just wanted to bring that up before I just start talking about men are bad, you know. So here's the landscape, and so this is some data that I got both from Carly in HR, but also I've updated it with a couple of numbers, and then also data on the national workforce ability. So for example, let's just see how are we doing on campus for the four, and we can quibble about the names, and I'm not loving all the titles, and I already changed one of them, so I don't call it Aboriginal peoples, for example, already. So, but basically the first number is where we are, and then the second number in all the comparisons is what the national workforce availability is according to, like as I say, 2015, 2016, most recent data that we have. So on campus, 58%, and the gender axis, and again, there's some problems in terms of just binning things, but in the gender axis, 58% of the people working on campus are identified as women. There's probably a gender binary problem going on there too. See, once you start the diversity work, it's so hard. You're like, wait, is that probably just gender binary? But anyway, so 58% versus a 52.5% availability. Indigenous peoples were underrepresented. 1% versus about 3.4. Persons with disabilities, again, underrepresented. And then members of visible minorities were about where we ought to be. Okay? So that's awesome, right? Well, I'm just going to use my faculty as data because, again, it's always more comfortable owning your own numbers. So these are, again, the same categories. I did not make the slide. I wouldn't have put the lines and stuff, but anyway, sorry. Bit of a data scientist here. But if you look at the numbers, you'll see some not so great trends. This is, again, from a few years ago, but I'm not going to pretend like, oh, it's way better now. It's probably about the same. So if you look at folks that identify as being Indigenous, that number hugs the line all the way across. So again, we're looking at assistant professor, associate professor, full professor, and then the instructor, senior instructor stream is what was called then. Obviously, you would add teaching professors in there now. So that's not great. When you look at women, remember that lovely number I showed you, right? It was like 58% on campus. Yeah, we're not there for academic staff. I don't need to, I'm sure this crowd knows. You have similar, you could probably come to a similar conclusion. And then some really problematic, or oops, wrong one. Here's a trend that I don't like to see, right? So high at the assistant, high, it's all relative. Highest at the assistant, drops at the associate, and drops again at the full professor rank. And then bounces up in the instructor stream. So what does that mean? To me, it means traditionally we've been comfortable hiring women in that nurturing, teaching, mentoring kind of role, right? Which is why I think we see that difference in numbers. Visible minorities, again, better, but again, you do see a little bit of that dropping off as you get to the higher ranks. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with time. And I'm hoping that those numbers, those lines stop being trend lines and just being flat lines across the board. We'll see. Anyway, so that's kind of that was the state. This is the data that I had at hand when I was actually put my name in for this position. And so that's what I've always have in the back of my mind. So really quickly, I just want to talk about the myth of meritocracy. I don't have time. That's probably just talking about that as a whole series of lectures. But I just wanted to bring our attention to the same thing here. So for example, here's just a really quick way of summarizing it, and that's to say we live in a society in which you can achieve anything with enough hard work. And I think it's really prominent south of the border. So you hear this fallacy, I think, that anyone can become president. Anyone. Well, maybe about 50% of people have a shot at it, right? Because we haven't had a woman yet. And I haven't seen a lot of I don't see a lot of diversity in terms of the kinds of people that do make it there. And we've had some Kennedy, we have some Bushes, and you start to really narrow things down. So I'm not sure that's really true, but there's that myth out there where you just work hard enough, you just apply yourself enough, and you can be anything you want. So basically that's lovely, and I want to subscribe to it, and I hope we get there someday. But basically what that means is, and as I have up here, it means that all these things that define us as individuals don't factor into opportunity. Okay? And how that looks in academia, because that's really where I'm going to, is this quote I hear over and over again, well, we hire the best. So really quickly I'm going to share. So I knew I was going to be AD, but it wasn't announced yet, so we had a faculty council meeting. And the position was being announced, and a colleague of mine at the back said, but we're still going to hire the best, right? So, right. So I was this close to saying something. I'm like, no, I've not been announced yet. Although that would have been a heck of a coming out party right there, hey? Actually, I want to talk about that. But we are going to talk about that. So what I'm going to do, just really quickly, so you're running a search, and it's been a while since I was trying to be an assistant professor. I don't know if these numbers are really low or really, but let's just assume these are two candidates you're looking at for a position. I know in general you have to have many more papers than even when I got the position. But so you have candidate 1 and candidate 2, 12 versus 9 papers, H-index, everyone knows the H-index? Okay. 8 versus 5. They happen to have USRI scores, so maybe they're from here. They have comparable, 6.3 versus 5.9. Candidate 1 has 2 keynote lectures. Candidate 2 has 1. Who would you offer the position to? 1. Okay. Thank you for playing along with the obvious game. As you know, we'll revisit the slide later. Just a little spoiler, of course, but. What I'm going to do then for most of this, before hopefully we get a little bit of a discussion around a document I have, is we're going to just talk a little bit about, and I'm going to single out gender, and I'm specifically going to talk about biases faced by women, but there is evidence for others too, but that's where I really wanted to start, and this is where I want to talk about today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about evidence that has been accumulating for some time now, and is finally, I think, getting a little bit more press, about all the challenges and systemic biases that are faced by women on the 3 major axes. So again, those that are faculty members in the room or want to be have been looking at, you know that you're judged on your research, productivity, your teaching excellence, and your service or your leadership. Okay, so I'm going to kind of just go through each of those 3 bins briefly with some evidence that shows that, and probably, at least for some of you, I'm not going to be presenting a whole lot new, but I think it's worth just having this conversation out loud. So here's a paper by Labriviere et al. In 2013. I've got the citations and we can share the deck later. But so globally, women account for fewer than 30% of fractionalized authorships. So again, accounting for their numbers, not like, oh, well, there's just fewer of them, so of course they're publishing less. I don't know why I did that voice, but anyways. It's supposed to be a dude bro voice, I guess. Whereas men represent slightly more than 70%. More troubling or equally troubling for me, women are slightly underrepresented when it comes to first authorships. Slightly. Oh, similarly, sorry, yeah, because it's not slightly. For every article with a female first author, there are about 2 articles first authored by men. And I don't know the culture here, but it's probably not that different from my field. You want to be first author or last author. Well, and ideally, better than not being an author is being in the middle, because you want to be publishing. But again, there's prestige associated with first authorship and lead, right? So, and those are typically different things, but you don't want to go up for tenure with always being in the middle, right? For example. Okay, so so number of papers, there's a bias. Citation biases, and this one's, I have to really kind of think about this one for a while, but there's actually not just women are publishing fewer papers on average, but they're being cited less. So there's an average relative citation index, field normalized on the y-axis, And then this is by region. This is how they did it. And I realized that I don't know why, but it's supposed to be lighter and darker, so men, women. And I'm not too worried about the differences among the three regions, but basically, in every single case, women are cited less than men when they're single authors. Okay. So this, I've been thinking about this, because I'm like, it's just a name, but I think that speaks to networks, obviously. Then they looked at the data, same data, for that same paper, they looked at the data now. If they're first author on a national collaboration, slightly better, but again, the bias, if there is one, it always in the same direction, with women being cited on average less than their men, their counterparts. Okay, so again, that H index starts to suffer from this. And then if it's a first author on an international collaboration, once again, the citation bias is there. Now, possibly, and it's okay if you're thinking this, you're just, yeah, but just a little bit, right? So I went to a diversity conference a couple years ago, and one of the speakers there, she talked about death by 1,000, I can't remember if it was paper cuts or death by 1,000 feathers, smothered by 1,000 feathers. So this is what I'm going to present here. There's never going to be a plot where, men are being cited field normalized 1.6 and women are being cited 0.2, right? It's never that big. It's that cumulative effect that I'm trying to build up here. No, I'm not trying to build up, but the story is that I'm trying to build up. I would like to smash it. And again, citation biases here, lead author, gender, and citation. So again, in key positions, and again, looking at those bars, orangey red are women, males are in blue, and again, just showing the same kinds of data that I presented earlier, but now not region specific. It's the same pattern time and time again. There's something else I wanted to say about this. Okay. So that's on the research output front. So teaching evaluations, and I didn't pick, this was already from a slide, so I didn't actually pick on Kines per se, but I put engineering in there too. This is from a little while ago. So this was a report, and it was, I need to go back and read it in depth, but back in 2005, way back, so Star Wars wasn't yet back on the mainstream. A whole bunch of things were different back in 2005, but we had a report put together on campus around gender. And at that point, some analyses were done. So looking at data, 2000, 2003, and again, looking at the overall scores. And again, if you look at just the mean, 5.42 versus 5.9. If it was a core in the majors, 5.79 versus 6.36. Reasonable sample sizes, those are significant differences. So that was there. If you look at engineering, the data, again, these are probably, we can talk a lot about what exactly question 1 means on these USRIs. So that's that overall score that you get to, students get to fill in, independent of anything else. It's just their sort of gut feeling, and we're pretty sure it doesn't mean anything except, I don't know what it means. We're not really sure, but we keep using it. So again, and then the interesting thing here, just so that the men don't feel picked on the entire time, is that women and men rate women different than they do men. Okay, so it's so ingrained that even the women who, you'd think ought not to do it as well. So that really speaks to that culture. We're just all in it together. And so again, 5.2 and 5.1 for the woman versus 5.4 and 5.43 for men. Okay, but you're like, yes, but that was a long time ago. Surely we're a lot better now, right? Okay, so this is a paper that just came out, and I've got the citation. I'm on Twitter, and people know me, and I've got a really, really good colleague, Jessica Theodore, who's a paleobiologist, and every once in a while I'll just go like, hey, one more for the pile, Steve, so this was one of those ones I had to share. So again, this is one of those, I could have shown you papers with lots and lots of data. I like this one because it's a little bit more focal. So again, those of you that really need big ends, just pay it, just keep going along, because those exist too, but this is an interesting case study. So basically what we have here, and the paper was written by Professors Martin and Mitchell. So we have identical online courses with almost no opportunity for variation. That's direct quote from their paper, right? So not interacting with these instructors very much except during office hours and a little bit of email contact. Okay, so in theory, there should be very, very little, if ever there was not going to be a place where gender bias would creep in. You'd hope this was the place they would do it. So the lectures, assignments, and content are exactly the same in all sections. And then you look at the student evaluations, and then you look at the difference in terms of, or whether there are differences in terms of what the students are commenting on. And 15.6% of the comments mentioned something about personality for Professor Mitchell, the woman's evaluations, and only 4% did for the man. Interestingly, no one mentioned anything on their appearance. I think they saved those for Rate My Professors. Entertainment, the entertainment value, I guess, 32%. Again, difference there in terms of students, both, again, men and women, commenting on the entertainment provided by one professor versus the other. They agreed that there was not a big difference in terms of intelligence/competency. No one talked about them being incompetent. And then this one, which I'm sure isn't news, unfortunately, but in terms of the number of times that Professor Martin was called a professor was higher than the number of times that Professor Mitchell was called a professor, and she got called teacher a lot more. Yay. So that's still out there, and this is again a very recent study. This is not, I didn't have to dust this one off. And then they also looked at the actual ratings, and I don't like a lot of text, sorry, but I thought I'd just provide the context in case you're wondering what the different things mean, because I was like, what does technology mean? But basically, there was a series of questions that would speak to various elements, right? And the other thing that's interesting is in this case, the grades were actually a little bit higher. Students performed a little bit better in her section than they did in his section. So if anything, they should have been more favorable in their assessment of her. You'd think, right? Presumably, that seems right. And they really highlighted that if there's gender bias, then it should show up in these three questions, although I actually think I look at the first one and think that's probably likely, that's probably being generous of them not saying that, but that if they were really, really reading, then they didn't expect to see any differences in the administrative stuff that's really high-level stuff that shouldn't have affected them. So they're not just filling things in, they rated them almost exactly the same when it came time to talking about questions about the administration. So how hard was it to register in this course, for example, right? So students are paying attention to what they're saying, and yet in every single case, 3.7 versus 3.3, 3.7 versus 3.5, 3.8 versus 3.6. And I think this is a 4-point scale, so a little bit different than our USRI funky 7-point scale. And again, and these are all significantly different. So again, I think about what happens when a head is sitting there, best intentions, doling out merit increments every 2 years, and sees lower scores for any one individual being totally objective. And I bet they're, in fact, I'm not trying to pick on heads, they probably are being totally objective. But if they don't know this, they're just feeding into that, that pattern. Okay, so that's not great. Okay, so then, well, maybe it's all fine because women get recognized for all the other things that they do. And that should show up in terms of awards. Well, sorry, not yet. Every once in a while, you do have a faculty that has an Associate Dean for Diversity who is in charge of the awards committee. So I'm doing what I can, but I can't fix it overnight. But that was a purposeful appointment by my dean, who didn't want to put the research associate dean in charge of all awards. He's now carving off some of the research ones, but again, there's a distinct message in there, and I think it's working, slowly working. So this is data from the AGU. So this is the big geology union. They had lots of data. So again, this is a paper from 2011. So again, not that long ago. And again, you look at the awardees, percent women for scholarly awards without medals, 7%. From 91 to 2000, looking at 2001 to 2010, wow, almost doubled. That's amazing. But when you start at 7, it's not hard. In terms of medals, 0 in that decade. I don't know. a big jump, but again, it's easy when you start at 0. Anything's an upward movement. Number of fellows stayed about the same, unfortunately. Early career awards went up. And then look at that. Nice high awards for service and education. So again, you see this gender bias creeping in all kinds of ways, right? So yes, we're willing to give, I'm just going to say it, the society was willing to give women some recognition, but it was rather pointed in terms of where those were starting to show up. All right. And then the last piece is the service piece. And I'm, again, probably speaking to the converted in some cases. And a really nice study referencing, so the quotes I have are referencing this Guarino and Borden paper from 2016, national sample, a bunch of universities in the States. They looked at, so women reported 0.6 hours more service per week than men, controlling for rank, race, I hate that term, and discipline. So I did a quick calculation. I was like, oh, that doesn't sound like a lot. But over the course of a 30-year career, that amounts to about a half a year difference. That's starting to sound like something. Now, okay, so they're doing more service, but interestingly, the difference was driven largely by internal service. So women were performing approximately 1 more internal service activity annually than men. Okay. And basically what they ended up saying was that the data sets, so they looked at a very focal set of studies, I think within a particular university or a few universities, and also this larger data set. That's what they're talking about, this data sets corroborating each other. But again, leaving little doubt as to the existence of a gender imbalance in faculty service loads, both in terms of the number of activities and also the amount of time spent on service. Oops. And again, when you think about the recognition and prestige that comes with, I don't know, sitting on an internal, space committee, not the fun space, but how are you going to allocate space on campus versus sitting on an international society panel, right? Again, that starts to feed into some of the differences that we see. So, what if now you know this? Okay, so a real quick thing. So now you've done all the work and you've tried not paying attention to everything, and now you have the 2 best candidates. And it turns out that the candidate on the left is John, Steve, I don't know, it doesn't matter. I could have put Steve and put myself on the spot, but I didn't have those numbers when I started. So, and then the other one's Jane. Who's better? Throwing this out to you. Any thoughts? What do you do at this point as a search committee?
Do we know what you just told us now?
You do, yes. So you've taken some training.
That might get factored into our consideration.
Yes. And actually, that's the main point that I guess what I want to do next is I'll switch to a document that I put together because I want to start doing a little bit more back and forth. Is that, again, getting back to this comment about but we'll still hire the best, is that you can do bias training, you can do all these things that people are talking about in the buzzwords, but at the end of the day, if you end up with a situation like this, it's not clear, well, it's clear to me what not to do, but it's really easy if you want to augur in and you want to maintain your position about the best, you can just look to the numbers. And what I haven't figured out yet, and I don't think you can do this for any one individual, because again, unfortunately, it's all population level data that I've presented, as it has to be. But then that population level data is made up of a bunch of individuals who are in that. And so, I don't know I don't have a good answer how you move forward exactly on this case, but obviously my sense would be that you'd want to have some kind of discussion around this, right? And it's possible that this individual who happens to be named John is in fact better in these particular things, right? Keeping in mind that these are all subjective things, but is actually the better person than this individual who happens to be named Jane. Or, also possible is that this person who doesn't just happen to be named John has experienced the benefits of all those things that I just told you about, and Jane has actually done remarkably well given all the other things that she's faced, and we don't even realize this, but there's a parental leave in here, et cetera, right? So anyways, there's the sources. So again, sciencey person, I feel like I have to put up my data and my sources. But what I really want to do, so hopefully this works, is I just want to So one thing I've started to do is, it's fine to know this exists, but I'm trying to figure out ways to get around this and help search committees out, because that's actually one of our big entry points and our gateways to, oh, this isn't showing all of a sudden. Anyone know how to get this back on? It says computer desktop. All right, you're like, what's he showing? It's on the same desktop, so that's... Yes, that's the one. Anyway, so basically what I've done is it's enough to talk about these things, but you need to give your search committees, oh, here comes help.
Thank you.
What do you want to show?
That document, please, yes. Ah, there we go. Thank you. I haven't lectured for a bit, so that kind of pops up. All right, thank you. So basically what I wanted to do is I wanted to start giving committees actionable things to work with, right? So, and I decided not to make a separate series of PowerPoints just for this document, and I'm happy to share this document with you all and use it or not, use parts of it, mold it for what it looks like in Knies. But basically, this is something I now have handed out to people who are going to sit on search committees in the Faculty of Science. And I've really gotten away from talking about bias, but we can, if we have a few minutes, I'm happy to talk about implicit bias. But I'm getting away from teaching people about bias and just putting things in place that might actually prevent bias from creeping in. So basically what I just do is I give them kind of what you just saw, right? So here's some salient points of the literature. So you just saw those. There's a big one that I didn't talk about in my presentation, and that's around reference letters. Men and women write differently about women than they do about men when they're recommending them. So women tend to get praised for being super hard workers and really keen and all that good stuff. And men typically get called, there's words like superb and genius and inspirational and all that good stuff. And it's not just men writing about men that way. Women do the same thing. Anyway, so I make sure that they know a little bit about that. I point them to, at the end, so I wrap my dean there, who's a fantastic ally, and without her, this position wouldn't exist, so I really have a champion in Dean Leslie Rigg there. Cite one of her works, cite another one about, again, gender biases, and then I link to, people can go to this long list if they want more, and this is being kept up. All right, so anyway, so I present them with some of the data. I'm like, okay, so that's out there, but what can you do as a search committee member? So I basically go through multiple steps. So again, for me, it's what you do before you ever look at the files, what you do as you look at the files, what you do as you meet as a committee, and then what you do as you meet with the potential candidates. So again, I'm not going to go through this point by point, but basically, I give a series of pieces of advice that say, slow down, know exactly what you're evaluating people on, and do it consistently, right? And then the big one too is this bit about keeping evaluations to only what's provided in the file. So I'm actually not that big on the advice that everyone needs to keep up a really active website, because I think that tends to draw people into looking away. Look at the file, look what they presented. So that's what I present as advice for reviewing applications. Then I also make sure I want people to think a lot about that actual first meeting, or those couple of meetings where you really narrow down that list, right? So again, I recommend that people, just like you do before a defense, right? You fill out your evaluation of the thesis, hand it into the neutral chair. Same kind of thing applies here. I want everyone to kind of do their rankings beforehand, go into the room with that sense, and have something in place so that that really excited, really talkative, that used to be me, person in the room doesn't get everyone all fired up about their one favorite person from Duke or Harvard or MIT or UBC. That would have been me promoting the UBC folks. And making sure you do all those good group norms, right? So round table, chair, zip it until the end, let your people speak, because again, you're the chair. They're gonna look to you for your advice. So if you, again, you walk into the meeting as a chair, like, hey, what everyone think about so-and-so? All the junior people will be like, yeah, they're great. So again, I make sure that there's this a real round table group think rather, and again, but going back to what was there. And also I recommend people go in ready to build people up rather than take them down, right? We have a tendency in the sciences to really criticize and take people down, whereas the reality is there's probably a bunch of people that you could hire that would be good for the position depending on what you're looking for. So let's find those relative strengths rather than go on and on about weakness of candidate so-and-so. And then of course, this is a little bit more obvious, but again, lots of things to make sure you do during the visits. Make sure you tell everybody, regardless of who they are, about all the things we have on campus that actually support people from different walks of life, right? Q Center, Faith and Spirituality Center, and these are big ones for science people to talk about, but I've just thrown it out there. I'm like, we need to start admitting we're humans first and scientists second. Again, make sure that when you meet with them, you have a series of questions that are the same, right? So you don't just sort of start talking about that fun thing with that one candidate that everybody really likes going in, and you kind of blow off the questions for the other person. Consistency, make sure they have lots of opportunities to ask you questions. And then of course, don't ask the leading questions. And I've talked to colleagues on campus, women, who are like, yeah, I got asked those questions. I avoided them. I steered them away. One of my colleagues is very good, and she kind of pointed out, yeah, let's not actually talk about this. But again, easy to do during the committee meetings, a little bit harder on those one-on-ones, and a little bit harder in dinner when everyone wants to share. And so give them opportunity to open up, but make sure you're not getting someone to talk about something they really shouldn't be doing. And the last one, I didn't put it in here, but I'm going to try to work it into the document, is thinking a lot about how you write that ad. And there's a lot of things you can do in that ad. And there's a project of mine that I want to start working on, something where you actually have the candidates give a short statement, something around values, something around collegiality, collaboration, inclusivity. And that way they have to say something, they see that we care, and the committee actually has to engage with that piece, and that's part of the scoring rubric. So that was less back and forth, it was more just me, But we have time, I think, so I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm happy to, yeah, you have me for a bit, so let's talk.
15 minutes. Questions for Stephen?
And now you know why all my students say, he's super excited, but he talks fast. Time and time again, yes.
When I was looking at the medal awarding form up there, the question I would have asked, what percentage of women were in the field?
Yep.
It would make more sense to evaluate the number of awards based on percentage of women.
Yeah, and I... Yeah, no, I agree. I do think that, I can't remember, and I have to go back to see the actual numbers as to why they presented them that way rather than just corrected. But I know that the membership in the society was a lot closer to 50-50 than those numbers, right? So it's not like women were 15% and awards were 12%. There's a fairly big gap, but absolutely. Yeah.
So you went through some things about what the committee can do, but are there any procedures in place about who makes up the committee? Because obviously if the committee aren't aware of their implicit biases and they're just a group of white middle-aged men, then those points may not help.
Yes. So, good point. So this is something I do think about a lot. And again, at least in my faculty, and not that it's not done elsewhere, but certainly we spend a lot of time thinking about who is put on those committees. I've had some interesting discussions around, you can't always put, so kind of getting to this similar point, if you're 20% of your faculty members are women, you can't always make your committees 50% women. Or you can, but there has to be some recognition of the additional efforts that are being put in by those women, right? So that, yeah, thank you. I'm like, yes, preach. But there's this place I've been in. And so recently, this is a slightly different way to answer, but I recently posted to Twitter the composition of a supervisory committee that I put together. I was super excited because it was 2 men, 2 women, and then the neutral chair, I can't remember, but then the student was a woman. I'm like, hey, 50% average, and that's something I specifically worked on to get that. Again, all good, all excellent people, but I was mindful of that. And someone I know from high school, so I don't know how Barry ended up putting out multiple professors in one graduating year, but she's at McMaster, and she, within minutes, it was just like, she kind of did the, but now you're making all the women do all the work thing. And so I was like, well, but hold on. Overall, probably not, because I'm very mindful of it. Others are not, and so probably it's not as big a workload. But it's something I struggle with, because again, I don't want to keep going to a fairly small pool and saying, hey, so we're doing all this diversity stuff, and we want to be better, but do you mind over contributing for the next little while relative to what you might otherwise? But the shorter answer is that yes, absolutely, we think a lot about who sits on those committees now. We think about expertise, but we also think about people that will be open and mindful of these things. And we make sure they get the training that HR offers. Late last week, I actually met with the person who oversees that training and gave some feedback based on what I think might make that training even better. So I feel like we're always saying this, but I think things are getting better. And it's certainly something we're paying attention to. I'm not going to pretend it's perfect, but it's definitely something. No, so we don't want this room. And I went to Haskayne, that in many ways looks like a faculty of science from that perspective. And again, they were trying to figure out how to change things. I said, well, the first thing is when you have that search committee, there has to be some diversity there, because you don't want that person walking into that committee meeting and not being able to see themselves at all, or it's not going to work. Is that okay?
Can you just
Yes.
expand on that in terms of, you're saying we, so are you talking faculty of science, or are you talking the university across the board is going to start putting some more policies and training pieces in place?
So
I know for us, unless I've been missing something, I don't think we have anything in terms of, like, I've sat on 2 committees for new hires in the past year,
Mhm.
and there was no initial, here's your bias training, here's your pieces.
Oh, okay. It's good for me to know. So HR and ODEPT offer this training, I think, to anyone who requests it.
But it's not like you have to have it yet.
I don't want to speak on behalf of, I don't know. But if you have had searches in recent times where there has not been any HR training, and you haven't had the director of ODEPT come in.
No.
Oh, okay. And I'm like, I know I'm being taped too, but that's available, and we make use of it. And I know HR wants it, so I'm surprised that's not happening, because I know HR really wants to make sure people get this training. We can talk offline, but anyways, that's good to know. So if nothing else comes of this seminar except that piece of information, I'm happy, because I've helped spread the word a little bit. Because I do think that, again, if you don't have the committee sit down together and think mindfully about this, then we're not going to get past, because then everyone in the room is going to look like, who they used to look like, right? And then they'll just recreate that thing. The piece I didn't sort of tackle, and that's a little bit harder one here, is you've also mentioned the white part, right? So, and yeah, academia is pretty white. Canada is pretty white. But again, there's that piece where, so I know a woman at U of T who is now an associate dean for diversity, but she's from the Caribbean, and for the longest time, she just wanted to be known for her science. Totally fair. And I think finally she went, you know what? I'm already doing this stuff all the time anyway, so I'm going to become an associate dean. She's fantastic, both as a scientist and now as an associate dean, but she was probably every single time someone's like, hey, we need a committee. Hey, I know. Right, so there's that tension there. But yeah, no, there is training. I briefly was doing a little bit of it myself, but I actually stepped back, and I think it should be central. I can't speak to immigration laws. I wouldn't want to be on the hook for having said something wrong, but that's out there. If every single faculty, as they should, starts to go to them, there might be a capacity issue, but I kind of argue that's a good problem to have. I think that office probably could use some expansion, right? So that would be one way to show, hey, we're constantly doing nothing else but these sessions, and the director of ODEP shouldn't be the only one doing all this, right? So, but yeah, the training's out there, but yes.
I'm curious, is your position in multiple faculties? Is there an associate dean?
I'm aware of 3. So medicine has had one for a long time, but it was diversity and professionalism, I think. So which go hand in hand, but it wasn't just diversity. And then about a year and a half before me, engineering created this position. And so Chow's son, some of you will know in the room. When we go to events, I introduce myself as Sciences Chow, and she does the same for her. And then me. As far as I know, though, that's it. We're the 3. Arts, their vice dean, Florentine, has it as part of her 1,500 things that she does all very well, but again, it's in there. So there's 3, 2 on main campus, but 3 in total.
How have you found reception to this type of work and training? And assuming you have received pushback, because this is, a very delicate but also like prominent subject, what type of pushback do you receive and how do you approach that?
Okay, as far as the training, there's generally good uptake, is what I hear. In part because I think we do pick a little bit who we're going to put on the committee, right? We're not likely going to put someone on there who's just happy to recreate old things. We have gotten a little bit of feedback, and I did share this with HR, that the training currently is a little bit long. So, right, it's 2 hours at present. It covers a lot of things, not just the diversity piece. And HR person I spoke with has appetite for cutting that back a little bit to 90 minutes. But so in general, we're not hearing at least a lot of pushback on that training part. Interestingly, someone had shared with my previous admin assistant that quote unquote Steve was doing too much for women. I honestly don't agree, but it means that maybe I'm doing a little bit of something for women, right? Because there's so much more that could be done. So it's varied. And I've talked to a couple of people like, look, you probably don't hear from the people who are supportive because they tend to just be like, oh, good, yay, keep going. You're going to hear from the folks who are not so on board. So there's some pushback, but I don't welcome it is maybe not the right word, but if I don't get any, then I'm not even doing half as much as I ought to be doing. So not everyone's on board, I don't think. But yeah, that's too bad. Yeah, I mean, in general, yeah, it's been good. I don't have people stopping me in the hallway, and I had one person stop me in the hallway, but it was more about just spending money on a survey around wellness. And I'm like, we didn't spend money, it's internal. Well, it's still money somewhere. Okay. So the occasional pushback, but mostly I hear from people who are just really happy that something's being done and science is doing something and that kind of thing. So yeah, that's not what keeps me up at night anyways. Yeah.
I have a question about if there's any discussion internally about the problems of the teaching evaluations, because that one always strikes me as one that, I mean, it's always hard to say like, oh, the publication biases and stuff because they extend across institutions. But
yep.
Most universities use teaching evaluations, and most of them have full control over that decision to continue to use them.
Yes. And I'm not on the teaching learning side, but I am in discussions with our currently interim AD for teaching learning. So we had a really good, he is amazing too, but Leslie Reed was our associate for teaching learning. She's moved on to an even bigger, better role. But he has tasked the teaching learning committee with looking at teaching evaluations in general. And my sense is that both centrally, so both within Leslie Reed's group and the Taylor Institute, but also a bunch of departments, there is a lot of discussion around that. I don't know that it's motivated by gender, but I think it's everyone who's there is very aware of the gender piece. Because in general, yeah, it's not awesome that we're viewed on basically a score between 1 and 7 is really how we value teaching effectiveness. So there's a really big discussion going on, and I think you'll start to see a lot of that. I, of course, welcome it because it's just one more piece where, yeah, it really does creep in. And hopefully if there's a more rich, and I've seen the sort of initial sketch of it, there'd be much more scope to talk about all the different ways in which, because then you can put in mentorship, right, for example, and all the different things that, I'll jump in for a second, women tend to do better than men. Not exclusively, No offense to the really awesome men. But again, that would start to kind of help, balance things out a little bit right now. Because, yeah, and then I've had some women share with me some of their evaluations, and they're just not cool. Yeah, they really get to some, not cool. But again, yes, Yes.
I'm wondering, first off, thank you. This is, I welcome, and I'm super happy we're having this conversation here. I think these conversations need to be happening far more frequently, far different, many places. So I'm really happy that this is happening. I'm wondering, because there's a number of us here that I think are either PhD students or postdocs. So we're going to be entering into that world of looking at whether we want to get in academia job-wise. We're going to be applying, things like that. No matter what our background is, do you have any advice for either how to navigate that process, or what should we be looking for? Say if we want to go to an institution that values these sorts of things, inclusivity, trying to promote equity, these really fundamental topics. What should we be looking for or be mindful of as we're entering that process?
Well, where did I put it? I guess, wow. I would look, well, if it's the state, sometimes they do it just because I think they have that Article 9 where they kind of have to do it. But I would look for institutions, especially if it's a Canadian one, where there's, for example, there is a center or an office for diversity. Go through their websites and go through part of the websites where you wouldn't expect them to be talking about that. And so when you look at, say, it's science or kinesiology or whatever faculty or school you want to get into, look at their pictures. Is it a bunch of people who look like me, or is it a bunch of people who look like the general population? And it's those little subtle things. And we actually have started, not that long ago, relatively speaking, but went back into all our materials and went, whoa, let's a little bit more mindful of that. Look at the ad. And again, so in our case, I really like the diversity statement that the University of Calgary has. It's not so obviously copy-pasted as some of the other ones. So I was looking at these and I'm like, this one looks like that one and that. So I think one, like U of T, UBC wrote one and the rest of the schools went, hey, that looks great. And when you see that, whether you're in a dominant group or not, you're gonna be like, wow, you really stand behind that, hey? So look for a personalized statement, look for anything else. And so, for example, look for a school possibly that does ask, how are you going to engage? How have you and how do you intend to engage with diversity initiatives, citizenry, collaboration? And make sure you ask those questions at the interview. So if you get shortlisted and you get to go, and they ask you questions, say, oh, do you have any questions from us? Sure, ask about your teaching load and things like that, but also say, so on the ground, substantively, what are you doing around representation? And it can either be, I understand that I'm a man, or whatever, or if you're not, but either way, I think you ask those questions and ask yourself, did they put any emphasis on that at all? And then if you're lucky enough, then I guess make sure that, yeah, you're mindful of where you recruit, how you recruit. And then, yeah, the other thing I'm working on, there's all these things that I'm working on or should be working on even more, but I'm trying to think about how I get an allyship circle going in the Faculty of Science. Because again, she left with that question about, who sits on these committees. And I go to diversity events and they don't look a lot like me most times, right? So I went to like a Dreamcatcher workshop, not obviously a gendered workshop, but it was part of Diversity Week. And I walk in and there's this one younger man there and he was so relieved. He's like, oh, I can stay. Because it was all women. And so diversity events, all of a sudden it's like, where are my males? Where are my men? So I'm trying to come up with some kind of allyship circle, because again, all the work can't be on the Indigenous people, the women, the visible minorities, the persons with disabilities. Like, it can't always be them. And so, conscious we're running out of time. It's an interesting thing being a white man as an associate dean for diversity, but it does give me some ability to rep some folks that they can go and do their work instead while I speak for them. But so that was sort of a roundabout way of answering, but yeah. Look for authenticity, I guess, is maybe the short answer for that.
Good, we're out of time.
Oh, that went longer than I thought.
Your time, and you
Yes.
get to eat friendly. So please join me in thanking Dr.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. So.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, guys, there's lots of food if you want some more to grab and go. Otherwise, we'll organize them there.